During this lecture, we're going to talk about A1 and A2, which are going to be completing this week, as well as how it relates to architecture. So first, you're going to be working on 4x6 cards. These should be plain cards with no lines, and you're going to do 2 sets, and they're going to be four cards in each set, which totals 8 cards. So the first thing you need to do is to learn how to construct a grid. Now the word construct is pretty important because we're not going to be measuring these lines. You're actually going to construct these grids using ideas about proportion. So here you can see the construction of a quarter grid as well as an eighth grid. That involves dividing the card into halves and then further dividing, and as you can see here, the red lines show you the lines that are developed using these diagonal lines. On top of these same cards, you're going to also be constructing a grid of thirds and a grid of 6. You can see here, these use center points that connect to corners rather than corner to corner. Pay attention to these, and we will go over these in class as well. And this is called a tartan grid when you overlap these. Now, one of the first ways that this relates to architecture is through proportion. And you can see here, these are 2 projects. On the left, you have a house by Le Corbusier. This was done, as you can see, in 1916. And then you've got the Villa Rotunda by Andrea Palladio. This was done in the Renaissance, so during the 1500s. You should notice that proportion is the relationship of one thing to another in terms of quantity, size, or number. The ratio, the comparative measurement of parts to a whole. And this is something that you're going to see in architecture throughout history. Proportion is one of those things that you can look at a modern building and talk about proportion. You can also look at a building that's 500 or 600 years old and talk about proportion, as well as one that's, several thousand years old. So first, once you get your grids constructed, and you can see the grid constructed here, you've got the grid of quarters and the grid of 6 on top of each other. Then you're going to add 4 lines, and these 4 lines are going to represent 2 figures. There's a top figure and a bottom figure. The only rule is that these lines cannot touch the edge of your card, and you need to use the grid to construct them, meaning that they need to stop and end at a grid line. These lines that you add on top of the cards should be darker than the grid lines themselves. Once you have your 2 figures, then you're going to take one of those figures and you're going to shift that figure. You can shift the top figure or the bottom figure. It is up to you. So here you can see in the top right where we began, and then the larger images show the shifted figure. Next, you are going to shear the shifted figure, meaning that the figure that you move to the right or the left will now be cut off where it overlaps the second figure that was stationary. Again, in the top right, you can see that second step, and then the third step here with our sheared figures or our edge-aligned figures is larger. And then for the 4th step, you are going to have fitted figures, meaning that you're going to add back a portion to the shifted figure. So in the top right, you have the sheared figures, and then in the larger image, you have the fitted figures. This is a very simple assignment. There are 4 cards to each set, and there are 2 sets. Your sets should be different, meaning that you should start with the different figures for both of these. So you'll have 8 cards in total. They will all be different, but there will be 4 cards in a set. You will begin with the figures, then you will have shifted figures, then you will have sheared figures, and finally you will have fitted figures. You should use the grid lines on all of these, and please do not touch the edge of your sheet. So hints to do well. First, you should look carefully at all of the examples that we've given you here in this lecture, as well as in the assignment on Canvas. You should start out with a very hard pencil like a 2H, And then once you add your figures, you should use like an HB pencil. You should draw the grid slightly lighter than the figure lines, and you should draw the diagonals even lighter. You should work with care because simple form readily reveals poor craft. And I would like for you to be aware of how much time you are spending on this assignment. I would encourage you to spend no more than 3 hours. You should use 90 minutes for the grid and page construction and 90 minutes for the drawings. This image here actually shows you that tartan grid. The purple shows you the grid of thirds, and the red shows you the grid of fourths or the grid of eighths. So these will be overlaid on each card. Just remember there are 3 different line weights. That's really important to start to practice using different line weights. These are some of the ideas that we are going to be talking about with this project. You should review these definitions. Many of these definitions are going to be given to you in a handout. You should review those. We would like for you to start to use these words when you talk about your work. Some of them are very simple, like craftsmanship, line weight, line, grid. The ground is actually your surface, or the drawing itself, the entire sheet, that's the ground. You also have different things like we talked about proportion. You also have alignment. We have asymmetry and symmetry. So please start to understand these and use them when you talk about your project. There are some other things that we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about contrast. So what similarities or differences show up just in something as simple as these figures on a grid. Repetition. Do any elements repeat on your sheet? Alignment. Do any edges and forms align, and on which axis? And proximity. Are some forms closer together or farther away from each other? These are some examples that show these ideas in architecture. So again, we have the Villa Rotunda by Andrea Palladio. So this building is symmetrical about both axes, meaning that if you folded this building in half vertically, or if you folded it in half horizontally, it actually all overlaps. So it's symmetrical about both axes. To the right of that, we have the Richards Medical Center by Louis Kahn. This one is asymmetrical with partial symmetries, meaning you can see how the unit of these square forms are repeated throughout the project, but overall the composition is asymmetrical. And then at the bottom we have a project by Richard Meyer, and this would be an example of something that is asymmetrical but balanced. And all of this happens through visual language, exactly what we are starting with here in Architecture 101. Repetition and contrast. Again, I'm showing you examples that are from a long time ago, but also very recent examples, like the Aqua Tower by Jeannie Gang. I think it was constructed 4 years ago, and it actually got the Best Skyscraper Award that year. It's in Chicago. But here you can see the repetition of the floor planes, but you also have contrast with the way that she allows the glass to come to the forefront, or those horizontal floor plates to come to the forefront. In the left, you've got St. Peter's Square in Rome, Italy. Here you've got the repetition of the columns. And then down lower, you have a building by Frank Gehry on the left that's in Prague. And you can see here he has contrast with straight lines versus curved lines. He has contrast with material, but he also has repetition with those lines, especially the lines on that glass piece that comes up. But you have repetition with the punched windows as well on that same project. And then to the right, you have a house by Raimondo Guadagni, and here you have repetition in terms of color, in terms of material, and then in terms of window size. These are examples of projects that use alignment and axis, and here you should see how big a difference we have in terms of scale. On the left, we have a building by Louis Kahn, the Salk Institute in California. Here, alignment and axis is very important in that project. And then the National Mall in DC, this is an example of urban design that uses ideas of alignment and axis to organize a city. Figure ground is something we're going to start talking about a lot. It's going to have a lot to do with what we do here this semester. So in the lefts, this is probably the most famous example of figure ground in the history of architecture. This is the Noli plan. And here, this is actually Rome. It's a plan of the city that uses the ideas of figure and ground to talk about mass and void. We are going to talk about this a little bit more in class. I would encourage you to go ahead and do a little bit of research on it so that whenever we talk about it on Friday, you can add something to the conversation. But that's called the Noli plan. To the right, we have positive and negative. This is also a figure ground issue as well. You've got a project by Jacob and McFarland, and then down lower you have another project by Louis Kahn. Again, these projects are separated by probably 50 or 60 years of construction. But up top, you've got this really big negative space that's been curved out of this orange cube. And then down lower, Louis Kahn uses very primary forms to carve out of this mega concrete structure. Some other ideas that are going to start to come up are dominant and subordinate. So on the left-hand side, you've got a project by Peter Eisenman. This is the same project. Up top is a picture of the model of that project, and down lower is an actual picture of the building. But in the top, you can see that there are these long grains or dominant grains that go across the project. They're very large cuts. These buildings are huge. There's like 8 or 9 buildings in this one project. Down lower, you can see that there are subordinate grids, and those are the grids that I would say start to break up the facade. So you've got dominant grain, you've got subordinate grain. In the right, you've got grain and cross grain again. These are projects by Zaha Hadid. One is a room. It's it's an idea for a master plan. But this was actually, a wall for an exhibit. Down lower, you've got an actual building that she designed. But you can see that there is a grain, so there's a dominant grain that goes throughout. In the top picture, that's the grain that I would say leads from the floor up onto the ceiling. Down lower, the dominant grain really completely swoops around that entire building. And then the cross grain is what goes against that. So we will be asking you to talk about your work using these same terms. The second assignment, we're also going to talk about A2. So in this assignment, again, you're going to have to construct these grids. Now, for a second time, please do not measure these lines. There's no way to actually measure this. Proportion is constructed. So on any size sheet, you can divide that sheet and have a grid of quarters, a grid of eighths, a grid of thirds, and a grid of sixths, and a grid of sixths. This is what we call our tartan grid. Again, make sure that your diagonals are the lightest line weight and that your grid comes second. After that, the figures in A2 should be the darkest. For this assignment, you are going to use the exact same compositions that you used for A1. So you will have 8 cards. You will have aligned figures or parallel figures. You will have staggered figures, edge-aligned figures, and fitted figures. On this, instead of drawing the 4 lines or the 6 lines that govern your figures, you're actually going to be using the black Canson paper. This you're going to be cutting with your X-Acto knife and your steel ruler on top of your cutting mat, and you're going to be gluing these onto the sheet of paper. Please use very good craft. You need a very limited amount of glue, but this is where we're going to get into that figure ground. So this is where you're actually really starting to bring out your figures with that black Canson paper against the ground of the grid that's on the 4x6 sheet. So first, draw your tartan grid. The diagonals will be the lightest. The grids will be slightly darker. You should cut the black figures with great precision, and you should carefully glue those down. Now, in terms of time, I would like for you to allow 3 hours to complete the entire exercise, 60 minutes for the grid, and 2 hours for the cutting and pasting. And this is what you will end up with. So this is one series where you have the lines from A2, and then you have the black Canson figures from the lines from A1 and the black Canson figures from A2. You will have 2 sets just like this. Now, where you put your figures is up to you. You should not copy mine. You should do 2 separate ones. It doesn't really matter where you start, but the results are going to be quite different depending on where you start. So this is one example of where you may begin. This project begins with a symmetrical arrangement of proportionate figures. You can see here that it creates a very balanced end result. This project begins with not with an asymmetrical composition, and it abbreviates the figures horizontally. Now, what ends up happening is that you end up with these very centrally located figures at the very end. So you can see how you can end up with quite different results depending on where you start and the decisions that you make. Again, this example begins by making its figures exactly the same. So these are identical figures in the very first example. And they're twice distant from each other, meaning that the space in between them is equal to 2 times their height. And this, you can also see the varied result that you get at the end of this. In example 4, this increases the distance between the figures while altering the balance of extremes of symmetry and asymmetry in the horizontal and vertical axis. So this really pushes the figures to the periphery of the project, of the assignment. Again, these are the ideas that we're going to be talking about. Figure ground is a very important idea that we will be doing all semester, but you should start to notice, your grain and your cross grain. Do you have a strong grain vertically or horizontally? Is there a rhythm to your project? Is it asymmetrical or symmetrical? And so in terms of figure ground, this is an example that sort of starts to explain the idea of figure ground. On the very left-hand side is a very simple line drawing, and many of you have probably seen this before. The second step turns that into a figure ground drawing where it darkens one spot, and here you might be seeing 2 faces. And then you can see in the third image, it's actually a vase. So depending on how you look at this, you can see 2 different things. You can either see 2 faces facing each other, or you can see a vase in the center of that image. And this is what figure ground is. You can look at it in one way, or you can reverse it into another way. These are some 4 basic strategy types for using figure ground. So in the top left, you have an intrude or erode. So you can see just by modifying that black portion coming into the white ground, if something is intruding or if it's eroding. Then to the right of that, you've got traverse or divide. Just by the different figure that is overlaid the white square, you get a different reading of whether it is traversing or dividing that square. In the bottom left, you've got a center and a wrap. So again, just by the type of figure or the way that it's placed on top of that white square, it looks like this black figure is either it's either centered on the white square or it's wrapping that white square. And then to the right of that, you've got displace and tear. So just the way that very simply you've got a black figure on top of a white square, you get all of these different readings. And so to relate it back to what y'all are doing, this is exactly what you're doing during A1 and A2. And you can start to see by those simple images at the top, which is the fitted figures, the shifted figures, the sheared figures, and the fitted figures. those can start to imply different conditions. So down lower, those gray spaces can start to be implied by the way that these black figures sit on the ground. Here's a way that you might take these into the 3 dimensions, and this is called Gestalt theory. So in our heads, when we see something, we start to try to figure out what it means, or we start to try to imagine what it is. So here, this is 2 black figures and how they might start to imply 2 volumes that have a courtyard in between. This is an actual project by Louis Kahn again. This is a real project. It's the Trenton bathhouses that uses a very similar situation than what we're doing. So you can see down in the bottom left, that's a plan of the project. You've got these heavy square figures that happen in the corners of these sort of larger square spaces, and those are actually pillars in the project, and you have these central meeting spaces. This is another place where Gestalt is being used in practice. This is a project by Zaha Hadid in Rome, Italy. Again, to the far left, you've got her sketch of the project. This was her idea. These are figures on a ground or on a sheet. Then you can see how she transformed that into a site plan at the top, in the middle top. Down lower is the model of the project, and then you can see the actual project on the far right and how the essence or the gestalt of that initial sketch is captured in the final building itself. That concludes Lecture 1. I look forward to seeing you on Friday. Please review this lecture beforehand and come prepared to talk about all the ideas that are presented. You should go ahead and review the definitions that are handed out with this lecture because we will be asking you about those. Thank you.